Hello again, everyone, and a big welcome to those of you who have just joined. I hope you've had something to eat, you've had a cool drink. I, for one, am certainly struggling with this heat, so I hope you're keeping cool. My name is Toyosi Chokan, and this next session is led by Christina Macurola, who is the Director of Global Experiences and Events at Microsoft Elevate. And we also have Britt Pimola. She is the Storytelling and Advocacy Director, also at Microsoft Elevate, and she will cover storytelling and AI. But before I hand over to Christina and Britt, I just want to share our usual housekeeping rules and pointers for anyone who has just jumped on. There will be a time at the end of the session for questions, so please add your questions to the Q&A box and we will cover these off at the end. Slides and other resources will also be made available after the event. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Christina. Welcome, Christina.
Hello, everyone. It is such a delight to be with you all this afternoon. My name is Christina Macurola. For some visual identification, I'm a white female with glasses, and I'm sitting in my home office. Britt, how about you?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Britt, and I'm a Hispanic female. I have long brown hair and dark glasses, and I'm sitting in my hotel room live from Geneva.
Amazing. Britt, thank you so much. And to the team behind the scenes, if we're able to get those slides up and running, that would be terrific. So by a little bit way of background, as we were introduced, Britt and I work in the storytelling and event and experiences space, and we have a tendency to piggyback one another all of the time in the work that we do. If we just go to the next slide, my work is predominantly focused on our events, experiences, and content development. And I also feel really close to this community. Before my time at Microsoft, I spent over a decade working for nonprofits and charities based in New York City. And Britt and I have some things in common in that front, don't we, Britt?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. I started my career actually at the American Red Cross, where I supported the Greater Miami and the Keys chapter, and I was a spokesperson as well as a public affairs and disaster instructor. And might I add, we're also both Duolingo junkies. So that's another personal thing or note on our end.
So let's talk about why we're here today. So the Microsoft mission overall is to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more. And frankly, that can sound pretty lofty, especially when working with organizations and teams that are right in the middle of the digital divide right now. What does it mean to feel like you can't catch up or the technology is changing too fast? And we see this across organizations of all sizes, but we know that this is true in the charity space because frankly, there are much bigger things to think about and worry about, particularly as it pertains to accelerating your mission. And that's where Microsoft Elevate comes in. We are a small team within Microsoft that's dedicated to bridging that gap, particularly in our work with charities, education institutions, and workforce policy. And we do this across tech innovation itself, of course, but also skills development with these organizations, public policy and advocacy, and working through our extended partners. Today, specifically, we're going to talk about things that Britt and I really love, and that's storytelling, because no matter how fast the technology is changing, it's all about keeping humans. And that's where storytelling really sets us apart. It's what makes our brains tick. And so we're going to talk about storytelling all up, what makes a good story. And then we're going to talk about the intersection of storytelling and AI specifically in terms of how you can use it as a tool in order to promote your own thinking. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Britt to kick us off.
Thanks so much, Christina. Well, I think everyone in this room is already a storyteller. You do it every day, probably with much smaller teams or tighter resources and a lot of high stakes that most brands don't have to face. But I'm not here to teach you about storytelling. I'm here to share how we're approaching it, the way that our team thinks about doing justice to the mission impact stories that we're trusted with to tell every day. And of course, many of them are alongside organizations just like yours. So for us, it starts with the question that we keep coming back to. Why do we tell stories? Because no one gives or volunteers, or in the case when I was at the Red Cross, gives blood, right? Because of information alone. And the data does tell us the scale of a problem, but it doesn't really give us the sense of what does it feel like? What is that life? What is that family? What is that moment that a story will do? And to get that right, we really need to think about what that process looks like. And so that's a little bit about why I'm going to share a little bit more today. If we go to the next slide, it's important to note that our brains are hardwired for stories. And this isn't just a nice idea, it's actually biology. And it's the advantage that all of us that tell stories have, including many of you here. We really are built for narratives, whether it's a bedtime story or fables or movies or, even a video game where it's already wired in. And the part that I love the most is that the research really shows that when we hear a story, our brains release oxytocin, and that's the chemical that's tied to empathy and the urge to cooperate. So a story lights up the same regions of the brain as if we're living that moment ourselves. We're actually putting ourselves in their shoes. So the data proves that the scale of the issue, but the story is really what's proving why it matters to one human life. And that's what really makes a stranger feel it in their own body. So I know every one of you is already working with that superpower. And without ado, I'm going to go into the 10 principles of storytelling. I will say we're being quite ambitious to do all of this in 25 minutes. So I might go a little faster than usual, but we're happy to follow up with questions and connect on LinkedIn. So when we think about, and I think we can go to the next slide, please. When we think about the next 10 principles, what really makes a story land in our opinion, it's these 10 principles that keeps us coming back. And it's not rules. It's definitely not necessarily a checklist, but think about them as questions that we're asking ourselves to make sure that we're doing a story justice. So you'll probably recognize most of them. You probably do them instinctively, but naming them is just going to help us really do them with more intention and more purpose. And we know nowadays we're moving quite fast. So if we can go into the next slide, please. I think when it comes to storytelling, point number one really is getting to know your audience. Be very clear on who you're speaking to. And you know this from experience, is it a trustee? Is it a donor? Is it a volunteer? Is it, somebody that's participating? And they all need different stories. So the donor wants to see the impact. The volunteer wants to feel the belonging. A policymaker might want to sense the urgency and the credibility. So before we write a word, I think it's really important. What do they already believe? And what are we inviting them to do? Next, we're going to go to define your message. A formula that we really lean on is that issue plus a human impact plus that hopeful action. Digital inclusion for us isn't just about connectivity. It's a barrier to education, work, health, and belonging. And with the right support, that changes. So we always ask ourselves, if someone remembers a single sentence, what would you want it to be? Next, we go to telling the story as if you're telling it to a friend. And this is one where we find ourselves in the day-to-day, in the jargon of the work that we do. But it's always really important that when you're trying to reach that broader audience, you really take some time to think about it as you're telling it to a friend. We don't want to slip into that sector language. And I know I catch myself doing it all the time. So instead of we delivered wraparound services to beneficiaries, you can say something like, we help families find the support they needed in one place, right? So it's the same idea and concept, but now in the same way that you would be talking to a friend over a coffee, etc. If we go into the next slide, this one is about setting the scene, right? It's about a place, it's about a time, it's about in what world does this story live? And so, for example, if you want to give people a context, you could say something like, every Thursday morning, families were queuing before the doors even open. The moment that people are seeing that world, they start putting themselves in it and starting to drive into that immersion. Again, how our brains are wired, and you're starting to introduce them to that path. If we go to the next one, thank you so much. So this is where you're going to find your characters. It's where you're going to ground yourself on that human center. So the protagonist is really going to be that person or the community that's living the change. In this scenario, we also think that the challenge is the barrier, not necessarily a person. And I know this is important when we think about the work in the social impact or nonprofit sector. So I think this is the one that is easiest for any of us to slip on. Our organizations are the enabler, not the hero. The hero is always the person that is being served. And I think honoring that is a big part of doing a story justice. We're then going to go into the conflict or the tension. We look for the tension, and I tend to think it's rarely sensational, right? It's really about what that gap between what is and what should be. So, for example, a community with talent but no access, or a young person with ambition but no opportunity. That gap is what actually is going to pique interest and make an audience want to start to care. We then move into tuning into the senses, and we should always aim to reach to the senses, because being that specific is what's going to make the story more believable. So it's not about saying something like, not many students join the program, but getting really specific and saying, hey, on a rainy Tuesday evening, 18 students stayed after school to build their first app. A photo, a quote, a sound, something that's going to help carry the emotional depth that the data alone can't. And then in this particular image, this is Satya Nadella, the Microsoft CEO, in Kenya during the Windows launch. And the power of this image carried throughout so much media coverage globally, because the image in itself carried a story. So again, just thought I'd bring an example here. We then think about, the surprise element. We want to really look for an honest surprise. And it's a question that I ask a lot of people when we're working on a story. Is there something that you didn't expect? Because that twist is what can help sometimes reframe the entire story. And I've seen it happen time and time again. When I ask this story, sometimes a little bit further along in the process that I like, but I always see another angle to go deeper and to really connect with people. So think about the opportunity that we have just by asking this question and going deeper and giving people that surprise element. Then the other piece, and I love the role that I do. I feel it's an honor and a privilege to be able to do it. And I also make sure that I bring myself, because it's important to be part of the work that you're doing in so many different ways. So to me, the most powerful story isn't always just the founding story, but sometimes it's that moment where you realize that the work mattered. And one example is, for me, it came from years in the Red Cross, doing a lot of disaster communications. That's where I really learned the power of story. And I learned that people don't just need information, they need clarity, they need dignity, they need hope. And that's what storytelling done well can offer. And it's specifically why I still love doing this work. So just keep that in mind. Of course, you want to stay curious. And one of the ways that we do this is we keep asking why. Why is this work important? Why is this solution, or is this program, or is this effort important to others? Are we making any assumption? Are we missing anyone's voice on the table? And that is where we're able to bridge to what's next. And because the better questions that we ask of the story, the better the questions that we can ask of AI that you're going to see shortly. So at this point, here's what I want us to hold on to as we move into this next AI part that Christina is going to lead us on. At the end of the day, these 10 principles are the human decisions, right? So AI will help us with the research, with the adaptation, translation, or repurposing. And it can help stretch teams move faster than ever. But it really doesn't get to decide whose story matters, whose truth we're honoring, or what dignity looks like. That's going to come from your work, thinking about all of these 10 elements that I shared with you all. So with that, I'm happy to pass it on to Christina.
Thank you so much, Britt. If we can move over to the next slide. Everyone here is going to see that I am one for an analogy. So if all of the principles that Britt laid out are the ingredients that we need in order to deliver a beautiful and effective story, we're now thinking about the tools by which that we are going to mix those ingredients together. Sometimes it's going to be your whisk. Sometimes you may need something a little bit more powerful because of a time crunch that you're under, and maybe you go for the stand mixer. And that's oftentimes how I think about AI use in my own life and in my day-to-day, because as much as we want to do the most incredible work possible, we're also dealing with the reality of our time constraints. And I think that is a key consideration as you're working through whether or not you want to use AI for a project or not. It's all up to you. It's your choice. And there's a few different ways that AI can play a role. So if we go to the next slide, particularly when it comes to storytelling or figuring out how I'm going to engage an audience on stage, I think about AI fitting into 3 key categories. 1, it is a mechanism for me to do my research. 2, it helps me with the overarching story development. And 3, it then helps with the story amplification. The story is oftentimes not just the one-time delivery of a story, but rather how are you bringing people into a room? How are you amplifying what you shared after the fact? The next slide is one that we probably could have done an entire session on. If anybody wants to take a moment and do a screen grab of this, I know that slides are going to be available later, but this is actually one that I truthfully keep on my desktop at all times. And it's the ingredients for a prompt. We're still in a phase with AI where prompting is the delivery mechanism for us to get whatever AI tool you are using to respond back to you. And the old adages stay true. If you put garbage in, you put garbage out. So the best way in order to ensure that your AI tool is delivering the information that you need is to be as specific upfront with what you want it to do. What is your end goal? Why do you want this to be your end goal? Because that will change tone shifts. What is the delivery mechanism that you want to receive? And where are you pulling your information from? All of this is going to be critical as you do your research. What's interesting, and if we go to the next slide and then immediately to the slide after, is Britt and I did a very similar presentation about 6 months ago, and I had to split the research and medium parts of the presentation because they worked in different tools and we had to view them differently. We're now in a phase with some of our AI tooling that you actually can do your research-oriented tasks within the environment that you want to deliver your story or your presentation. So if we go to the next slide, not surprisingly, I work for Microsoft. I am in PowerPoint almost all day, every single day, trying to put presentations together. And so as a result, Copilot has become one of my best friends. For those who are not familiar, there's actually hundreds of different Copilots that are available. The one that I'm going to be talking about specifically today is Microsoft 365 Copilot. It is an add-on if you have Microsoft 365. And you can tell if you have this by speaking to folks on your IT team. And you also get a clue if you see that little Copilot button in the bottom corner of the applications that you use every day. So let's go through an example that I've actually found myself having to do. If we go to the next slide, I do a lot of presentations where we're talking about the contextualization of AI. And something that I find very useful is to tell the story of the history of AI development. It can seem that AI really has only hit us since 2023 because that's when LLMs became a larger part of our lexicon, but we have decades of history that go into it. And sometimes that framing helps settle the moment that we're in. So I'm going to ask my assistant Copilot to create a 10-page PowerPoint on the history of AI. I'm really specific about where I want Copilot to pull sources from. Microsoft has our AI for Good lab and our Microsoft Research Labs, which have done lots of research on this and also have published a lot on the history of AI. So let's use that so that I have a grounding to check my sources. So if I go to the next slide, I provide this prompt and the LLM starts working. If we go to the next slide, you can actually see that I did not do a particularly good job of my prior garbage in, garbage out. I'm getting follow-up questions. Number one, it wants to know what audience is this presentation for? And it absolutely makes a difference if you're talking to some of your internal stakeholders or if you're talking to an outside group. Similarly, when I was working in marketing and development, the way I would present something to our board of trustees may have been very different than public communications if we were in a community-oriented space. So I choose who I am directing this to. And if we go to the next slide, you'll notice that there are still more follow-up questions. Should I be organizing this presentation chronologically? Should I be thinking about thematic groupings in terms of how AI history progressed? I'm telling it to do a little bit of both because the story is not necessarily the most linear. If we go to the next slide, we can see that Copilot is still thinking. And if we go to the slide after that, we're now getting into the tone and how I actually want to set the stage. You know, when you're dealing with visual presentations, your stylistic choices are going to make a very big difference. So in this instance, it's given me a few options. Something that I also could have offered up here is to actually link to a template that is true to our brand so that it's staying consistent with other communications that I have. But that flexibility is available to me. All right, so I'm going to keep going. It does its thinking. And I am presented with a 10-slide PowerPoint presentation that speaks to the history of artificial intelligence. We often talk about the human in the loop. For me, it's still about the human that is controlling the loop. So I go through slide by slide. If you go to the next slide, you can see an example of not only the slide itself that was produced, but the rationale that Copilot gave me for the ordering of the slides, things that I can be thinking about. And this is where I do my deep dive. I'm running against that checklist that Britt put together to make sure that I'm staying true to the story. If anything, I found that, you know, in the last few years, and again, in the acceleration in the last 6 months in particular, honing my editing skills has become critical, not only in terms of what's written, but also stylistically. If we go to the next slide, you can see that Copilot doesn't always get it right. Formatting isn't always there. Me as the human has to be part of the system. So I spend time with my story, I go through it, and I think this is looking pretty good. It's also showing where Microsoft sits in terms of overarching AI history, but I think it could do a better job of actually showing, you know, what is the human impact of some of this. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that while diving into the slide on our AI for Good program, I actually ask if we can create a new slide that dives deeper into a particular case study that the AI for Good Lab has done. And if it responds to my prompt, if we go to the next slide, you can see the slide that was actually created for me so that we could go deep into the weeds. And again, going back to Britt's list, and again, if you want to screenshot a slide, this is a good one. It's really important to keep going back to the principles list to make sure that everything is clear. I'm aware that we're in our last final 5 minutes, so we're going to blow through the next few slides very quickly. We also talked about story amplification. So if we go to the next slide, this may be a presentation that I'm giving to a large group of people outside of Microsoft, and I want to be able to amplify it on my own LinkedIn. I want our email team to be able to create a draft for our sales force so that they could send invitations out. So within PowerPoint itself, I can actually ask if it would be possible to draft an email and a LinkedIn post based on the contents of the presentation. And so if we go to the next slide, you can see that it does its thinking. All I have to do is copy paste this into a Word document, an OFT template for email. I would do all of my editing, again, deep thinking, making sure that everything is true, making sure that I'm adhering to brand language. And then I'm able to amplify it after the fact. So with that, and again, mindful of time, I'm just going to pass it off to Britt for some closing thoughts.
That's great. And I love those tools. So to bring it together, what's really important for us to take away is that when we pair the real storytelling with tools like we just saw from Christina, there's really something powerful that happens. We can create really deeply personal stories that genuinely resonate with your audiences at a scale that sometimes wasn't achievable for many small teams. So I encourage you to try, to experiment. It's the best way to learn. And it can also help lift the load of a lot of teams that are feeling quite stretched today. It can help us learn how our audiences are responding. It can help us reach more people and in more languages than before. So think about it as making sure that together with the technology, it's helping amplifying it, never diluting it. So if I just say one thing that you could take away from this room is that this is one of the most exciting times as it relates to how much we could do with storytelling, as long as the human really stays at the right front and center of every story. So let those tools do the heavy lifting, but keep your hands in the heart of that story. I think that when we bring our craft together with those tools, we're not just telling stories faster, we're able to tell them in a way that really does justice for the people that have trusted us with them. And I think that's the future of storytelling for the causes that you serve. And honestly, I'm excited about what more we can do and to see more of the stories that you are telling. So thank you very, very much for letting us come and talk to you today.
Thank you so much, Christina and Britt. That was so helpful. The principles definitely stand out for me. And to your point, Britt, really having that human element is always key. So before we wrap up, I think we can squeeze in one question very quickly. So based on the principles and thinking of the flip side of that, is there anything you would say absolutely will not work and could be detrimental? And if possible, do you have any examples of that?
Ooh.
Not work within the AI or
within any of the principles or storytelling, I suppose, more generally, I would imagine.
So I can speak from our experience, right? But this is a little bit different in the context that you are. I know that one of the key things working at a company like Microsoft, sometimes there's a lot of pressure to talk about products or to talk about certain solutions. And for us at Microsoft Elevate, we work with mission in mind and understanding that that's the power of the story and not making the technology the hero. So I think what not to do in many of these scenarios, and depending on your context, is making sure that you're pointing to the right hero and that you're not missing an opportunity to bring the audience closer to the action that you want to take. I think that's one part that gets missed a lot. I'll say that much since I know we don't have that much time. But great question. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you both once again for sharing your expertise with us today.